What's up guys, Chris Forsberg here and welcome to this week's drift response video. Let's get those questions answered.
Our first question from James Pitt. Is it 100% necessary to get all the extra arms after installing coilovers, or can you leave everything else stock? Mine is 70% street, 30% track. You definitely do not need all the arms just because you're installing coilovers. It'd be wise to do it. You can get a better alignment setup when you set your alignment up for the track or the street. However you're doing it, just more adjustability is better, especially when you're lowering the car with a set of coilovers. Some of the stock eccentric bolts that your car might come with might not be enough to adjust the alignment. So those could be too far out of spec where you'd want to install some fully adjustable suspension arms. So I would ideally plan on getting those in the future. That, and they replace all the old worn out bushings and everything with nice strong Heim joints with very little play. So it will be a step up for your car no matter what.
Alright, first question comes from Drift Kid Owens. With a heavy car like my 300ZX, what mods would you recommend doing first to help it drift? I'm with Chris, I like both form and function. Well, with any rear-wheel drive car, I recommend the same 3 mods when you're getting right off the ground to get that car drifting and very nice and controllable. So, first off is a rear differential. You want those rear wheels spinning together no matter what. Yes, some cars come with a mechanical rear diff, but you actually still want to get something that's a little stronger because even factory diffs will tend to slip and only spin one tire at a time. So you want to make sure that you get yourself, whether it's a clutch style diff or a welded diff, but whatever the case, get that rear end locked up and then you'll be ready to go. Second mod is a bucket seat. And now a couple people think that this is a weird mod because they want to get more horsepower, they want to get an exhaust or whatever the case is. But when you're a driver and you're in a drift car, you really want to be attached to the car, because especially if you have like a floppy suspension or if it doesn't make a lot of horsepower or anything like that, you want to be glued to the car and not just being thrown back and forth and hitting your knees on the door panels or the console. You want to be in control of that car, and to do so you need a nice bucket seat to hold you in place. And that also will help you feel the car and what the car needs and learn how to drive it better. And lastly, coilovers, because you really want to get that center of gravity nice and low. You want to take all the slop out of the suspension, because now you can transfer weight much easier when your car is planted on the ground. And that's a little bit of form as well as function, so that'll get you right off the bat. And if you want to go one step further, you can get a set of nice tires up front, because you want to keep the front end nice and balanced as well. You don't want too much push, especially in a heavy car like a 300ZX.
The Noob Gaming TV. What is your favorite car apart from the GT4586? It's a really tough, it's such a broad question. I love so many different cars, into so many different cars. But out of all the cars that I've driven, I guess to narrow it down just a little bit, I would have to say that my Pro Formula D Toyota 86 is probably my favorite car. The thing is just so well equipped for the track and for drifting, and it's been the most comfortable car I've ever driven up to this point for drifting. Now, if you want to broaden the horizons a little bit, I also got to drive my friend Daily Driven Exotics Ferrari 458, which I thought was an absolute blast of a car to drive. Now, the price tag on that is pretty high, but it definitely didn't disappoint. I had a blast driving it and would love to do it again. So besides that, I haven't driven too many other really high-end cars or anybody else's Pro Formula D car that's kind of up to the same spec. So I am into muscle cars too. Do love some old school muscle cars. I've been looking at them a lot more often these days, and hopefully get to pick one of those up at some point. So it's just kind of broad. It's a tough question to narrow down for sure. Hope that helps though.
Alright, next question comes from Rainer Rand. Very useful tips how to set up the suspension, thank you. But you didn't talk about the front wheel's toe. What are the advantages and disadvantages of running toe in and toe out? So on the front end of a car, I thought I'd discuss this a little bit and mention that on our track cars, we tend to run toe out in the front of our cars, because that helps with your turn in when you're wanting to get that car initiated into a corner, or even in a road race application. It helps the car plant over the front end, turn in, and get that corner. The disadvantage of that is if you're running it on the street, the car is a little twitchy at high speed, and that's also a little bit of a disadvantage in a road race application too. So you want to be careful not having too much toe out in the front end because the car will tend to track and have a really light front end. On a toe-in situation, that will keep the car tracking straighter and it'd be a lot easier to drive at high speed, typically used on street applications and even some road race applications. It's all very driver dependent, so what you like best. The problem with toe-in is that you don't get that initial turn-in grip that you might be looking for when you're building a drift car.
Robert Houck or Robert Houck? Sorry, I might have butchered that. What kind of front tires do you recommend, and can you have too much front grip? I would definitely recommend the brand new Hankook RS4. That's what me and Forsberg have been running this whole season, and they're absolutely phenomenal. The grip from the RS3 to the RS4 that they've developed is out of this. I mean, they knocked it out of the park. The tire feels so good and so stable everywhere, and has a ton of grip all around. So I would definitely recommend the Hankook RS4. As far as having too much front grip, I think that can apply to certain situations, but very seldomly will you find that you don't have, or you have too much front grip. If that's the point, if you have too much front grip, then all you need to do is just make the rear have more grip, and it'll balance it out. So I think if you find that you have too much front grip, there's something else that's not set up properly. So you should go back and try to set the rear up to balance out the front or around the front or something like that. I hope that helps.
All right, next question comes from Peter Hunter, who asks, what was your first car? So technically my first car was a 1987 Chevy Blazer. That was my brother's, got passed down to me once I got my license, but I only had that for a few months before I got my first car, which was my 1988 Mazda RX-7 Turbo 2. And so that was the car that I purchased to make into an awesome drift car because I just heard about drifting. It looked awesome, and I wanted to have something that was turbo and rear-wheel drive to be able to slide that thing through corners. And so I had that car, did a bunch of modifications to it right off the bat, and started taking it out to the track, and that was just an incredible machine. It had very little steering angle from the factory, and there were no angle kits back in those days. Myself and my buddy Tony Angelo, who had another Turbo 2, we were just strapping big turbos to them, making a lot of horsepower, and just controlling the car with wheel spin, not really knowing what we were doing at first, but it was very fun, very exciting, and definitely a car that will make you have to learn drifting very fast.
Simon Clark, this is a tough question to answer. How do you recommend setting the traction arms? You fitted them but didn't mention the setting. The traction arms on the S14 or S13 or even S15, they're all a little bit different, but you typically want to make them shorter, is what I've noticed when I've adjusted those and then tested the bump steer. They're really hard to adjust for the simple fact that you have to check the bump steer travel after you make a small adjustment on the traction arm, or else you have no idea what it's actually doing. So bump steer is what happens when your suspension travels through the suspension stroke. The geometry is gonna change your camber and toe settings. So as it comes up through a suspension stroke, it might add negative camber, it might add toe in, it might add toe out, and you just have to find that perfect setting on the traction arm that limits the bump steer as much as possible, and that's what the traction arm actually does. So I hope that helps. It's actually very involved and time-consuming to set up, but I have noticed that when you shorten the traction arm, it does help with the bump steer stroke through the travel.
All right, last question from Tired Hero, who asks, when getting your suspension dialed in, should you be sat in the car at the same time? Well, that's a yes and no question, because if you're setting up your coilovers, which when we were doing the episode, we kind of set the preloads and set the ride heights, doing it in a garage, so that's about as precise as you can get without corner weighting. And so if you are corner weighting your car, you got the scales on the car and you want to really dial in your car for maximum efficiency, yes, the driver should be sitting in the car, because now you're adding a solid 120, 150, 200 plus pounds to the car, and mostly on the left side. So you want to get those 4 pads working together so the car sits nice and stable and feels nice and even going left and right through the course. In regards to setting up your alignment, no, you don't need to have a driver sitting in the car, because when you hop in the car, you'll see that the overall ride height changes very, very minimally. Just like, even if you have a very soft suspension, I mean, the car is only settling, a quarter of an inch at the very most, but usually much less than that, especially on a car that has very stiff suspension. It's not going to move at all. And so with that being said, you can set your camber caster in tow in the front and the rear without worrying about any changes once the driver gets into the car. So you will have the same feel no matter what.
Macho Man Randy Sanchez, this is a good one. Do you think that you could fight off 250 feral cats if they had you surrounded in a dark alley? I'm pretty sure I would meet my demise that day or night that I found myself in a dark alley surrounded by feral cats, but I wouldn't go down without a fight. So hopefully somebody's there to record it. All right, guys, that is it for this week's Drift Response. Thank you again for all your questions and comments. Continue to watch Drift Garage, and we will be back with another episode soon. Keep drifting fun. Keep it sideways.